All right, excellent. So, my name is Claes Thorén, and I work at the Department of Informatics and Media at Uppsala University. And this is going to be an introduction to classical approaches to organization. And we're going to go through a lot of things. Usually this is covered in 2.5 lectures, so about 5 hours of normal teaching. But I'll see if we can speed things up a little bit, because this is only meant to give you sort of a primer, and then I will post links to the articles and movies and other resources that is useful for you guys to read after listening to this presentation. So the idea is to start by introducing the subject a little bit, particularly organizational history, which is what this deals with, the history of organizing and the history of sort of modern organizations, you might say. And then so we're going to start by talking about definitions of what of organizing and organizations, the difference between formal and informal organizations, division of labor, the Industrial Revolution, and down here to human resources and the development of sort of modern perspective of work and the worker, and the second revolution that sort of led us to the kind of more empathic type of leadership that we have today. So let's get started. So the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, why do we organize, and what is an organization? What do we need organizations for, anyway? And before we can answer that, we need to define what an organization is, and understand sort of the various types of definitions that we might attribute to organizations. And so, in brief, every person living in modern society is a member of a whole lot of different types of organizations. Already today, any of you that are listening to this, you're part of many different organizations that you move in and out of every day, all day. And we can identify various forms of organizing in our family, when we go to work, when we play sports, when we attend a university, all these sort of mundane activities that we engage in every day are part of various forms of organizations and various forms of organizing. Some may be more formal than others, but these are all 4 types of organizing. So for instance, in the family context, organizing is, you obviously, when you're part of a family, you're part of a hierarchy. You know, there are parents and there are kids, there are siblings. So there's definitely a hierarchy. The way you employ sort of division of labor, who does the washing up after dinner, who gets to tell who what to do, the way that everyone has to line up to go to the bathroom in the morning, who makes breakfast for whom, and how we organize our activities in relation to some form of hierarchy, how there's some form of division of labor and assumed responsibility, gives us a fairly formal organization. Same thing with work. So we leave the house in the morning and we go to work. And of course, when we enter into our workplace, we enter into a role of employee or manager. And of course, there it's very clear. The hierarchies are very clear. The division of labor is very clear. So there is, you know, a distribution of power. There is, you know, you have a formal organization with a formal hierarchy, divided into various divisions with managers and employees. So there's a clear sort of line of communication, you know, top down and bottom up and laterally and everything. So you have sort of structured communication moving and being dispersed in a formal sort of network. So the workplace is really sort of the epitome of what we associate with a formal organization. After work, we go and we play sports. So you're part of a football team, or you're part of, any kind of organized sporting activity is also a form of organizing. You engage in a group activity with a specific purpose. There's directions, there are rules, there's a clear sort of hierarchy there as well, where you have the coach and you have the players, and a division of labor that comes along with that too, and different responsibilities. You attend university, you take courses, you attend class, you write an exam. Absolutely a type of hierarchy and a type of sort of activity that you engage, that you enroll in, literally enroll in, and that has a hierarchy, power structure, all that sort of thing. So as we move between, from the family in the morning to the workplace, to the sports activity, and to the university, these are all various sites of power, various sites of hierarchy, and we can identify forces of organization, in all these four types. So with all this stuff that I've described now in all these four arenas, we might say, we can start defining what organized activity and organizations, what they are. So the traditional definition of organizing is that there's an explicit purpose. There's an overarching goal that is formally sort of articulated. This is what we want to accomplish. This is what we want to achieve. We have actors, several actors that collaborate to achieve this particular goal. And these actors, they also have their interactions designed in a specific way in order to achieve this goal. So you have suddenly, the more rigid and the more formalized this becomes, the more predictable behavior we get, the more formal the organization gets, and the more control we have, so to speak. And the tighter the culture is that is sort of kept within the framework of this particular organization. And it also because it determines, what is acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable behavior within the constraints of this organization. Now, it also allows us to articulate a slightly more detailed definition, where we can distinguish between organizations and organizing. Where organizing is more a kind of activity that can exist without formal organizations. So it allows us to define organizations as a corporate entity that has a registered name. It pays taxes, usually long-lived, very predictable, clear division of labor and that sort of thing. And there's a clear sort of articulated purpose that you agree to when you enter into an organization. But the most common way of distinguishing organizations from organizing, from acts of organizing or the results of organizing, is the registered name and being a legal sort of corporate tax-paying entity. Organizing, which is what we call sort of the more informal type of organizing. It's not a registered organization. It's more of an activity that we do that's organized. It's activated under during a limited time. There's no official name to it. It's much more informal. It might take longer. It might take shorter time. So an example of an organization, a formal organization, could be, like a hospital, or a McDonald's restaurant, or Volvo, or IKEA. That's an organization with a registered name that pays taxes. Organizing, or examples of organizing that only exists for a limited time without an official name, could be the usual sort of fika break that you have, where you sort of, you gather with a couple of classmates for 10 minutes, you have a cup of coffee, you sit down at a table at a cafe and you chat for a bit during a break, after or before class. It's not a formal gathering. There's no predefined something that you're going to talk about. It's just hey, do you want to go for a cup of coffee? Sure. And so you buy your coffee and you go and you sit down and you have a bit of a chat. That's organizing. It's still organized because you're several actors that congregate around a specific purpose, which is to sit down and have a social break, and there are certain accepted and unacceptable behaviors. You sit at the table and you converse, and there's a certain amount of expected behavior. You can say that in some ways it's formal, but it's much more sort of fluctuating. It comes and it goes. There's no set time. There's no set duration or anything like that. So that's the difference. That's how we distinguish between a formal organization and informal acts of organizing. Now, the whole point of establishing organizations is that we need hierarchy. And what do we need hierarchies for? Well, I mean, if you look at this picture, then it speaks its clear language, and it's just a sort of classical way of thinking about hierarchy is that the manager, has the best situation, and then executives, they have to take a little bit more of the crap, if you like, and then they crap upon the departments, which crap on the rest. And if you're at the bottom of this hierarchy, then you have the toughest time. So if this is what structure results in, then what is it good for? Why do we create these kind of pyramid organizations, these top level controlled organizations, these top down organizations? What's it for, except exerting pressure and terrorizing the people below you in the organization? Well, the answer is that it's not that simple. We need structure. Structure has a very specific purpose if it's done right. Obviously, there's lots of abuse and abuse of power and horrible things that can happen in a hierarchical structure. But if it's done right, it's, I would argue, a necessity. And why is it a necessity, you might wonder? Well, because we don't like chaos in organizations. We don't like chaos because chaos costs money, and it costs efficiency, and it makes for very poor business ventures. And business and profit is sort of what organizations are all about, you might say. So hierarchy allows us, or structure, I should say, structure and hierarchy allows us to go from sort of this situation where we have a chaotic group of people that are trying to communicate in all sorts of directions. No one really knows what to do. No one really knows who's in charge. We have certain things that are getting done by several people, maybe a couple of people that are doing the same thing, redundantly so. And then we have some people that aren't doing anything at all because they don't know what to do. So we have some things that are getting done twice, and we have some things that are not getting done at all, sort of falling behind the chairs, so to speak. And that's no way to run an organization. What you want is a clear division of labor and a clear line of managerial structure in order to make sure that everything is getting done and that everything is given the sort of the right amount of attention. So that's what we get in this type of situation here, where you have a person that is responsible for some other people that are in turn responsible for some other people. And the idea is to divide work tasks, distribute responsibilities, measure and improve efficiency. The typical sort of top-down communication hierarchy. which was really the first type of control in the first types of organization that we had sort of around the turn of the century, around early 1900s, kind of during the industrial era. Because the whole point, or sort of, or rather the way that all this started, I should say, is if we go back, we back up a little bit to pre-industrial times, we had the artisans, right? The craftsmen. We had the shoemakers, and we had the blacksmiths, and we had the carpenters, and we had the potters, where you had one person who really knew their stuff, their craft. They would hand make a shoe from scratch. You would manufacture the sole, you would tan the leather, you would create the shoelaces, and you would assemble this item until it's finished. And when you finish a pair of shoes, there's a little bit of a party, and then they ring the town church bell. The shoes are finished, and someone gets to buy and wear these shoes, right? So in the artisan times, then you're responsible for the whole sort of production from scratch, and while this was a very lofty way of working, a very sort of honorable way of working, it wasn't very efficient. So what happened was, the first thing that happened, when steam was I was going to say invented. The steam wasn't really invented, but the sort of the steam engine was invented, and we got more automation through the Industrial Revolution. It meant that we could have larger groups in factories. We could divide stuff and say, well, we still want to make shoes, and we still want to sew things, and we still want to manufacture stuff. But what automation allows us to do, particularly when the assembly line was invented, it allows us to take a product or an item or something that we want to manufacture. We can divide it down. We can split this complicated product, like a shoe or a car for that matter, into its component parts. So you have the car, and you disassemble it into all the component parts that is required to manufacture the whole product, and you divide this whole product into all the manufacturing elements that are required, all the actions, all the sort of assembly, all the sort of actions of assembly that are required to put this thing together. And you lay it all out on a conveyor belt, and you put all these people on a row, and say that you're responsible for step 1, you're responsible for step 2, step 3, step 4, and so on. And you divide this car into so many parts that it becomes that each assembly, or each action of assembly, each part is so simple that you can hire more or less unskilled workers, pay them virtually nothing at all. And if you take 1,000 sort of simple steps and put them together, you can get this very complex thing like a car. So if you only break it down into minute enough steps, then you get to these very simple things like turning a screw here, and putting these two things together, and hammering on this thing. And eventually, with enough of these steps combined, then you have the whole complicated product. And you've been able to use, not engineers, not educated people until maybe the very last step, when you go through some sort of quality control maybe, but you use unskilled labor during the process, during the assembly line process, to keep costs down and keep efficiency up. And you can manufacture many more of these. You don't have to wait. You don't have to ring the church bells every time the shoemaker finishes a pair of shoes, but you can have shoes roll out of the factory on an assembly line. So that was sort of the idea of, or I should say the sort of the gift of the Industrial Revolution to organization. And there you have it. You have sort of the clear division of labor. Who turns which screw, who puts these two things together, who assembles the car, who is responsible for each step in the assembly of this car. So clear division of labor, cheap labor, unskilled labor, and a clear sort of managerial line where you have a manager that oversees all these unskilled laborers, making sure that they all sort of fall in line and that they do what they're supposed to be doing without slowing down the process and so on, and keeping the manufacturing going and keeping the efficiency up. So this was sort of the idea of the assembly line, you know. Now, the Industrial Revolution and this way of thinking about organized work, you know, that the idea is to use these unskilled laborers, and you know, if you only give them simple tasks to do and you break this product or this thing that would the manufacturing process into enough small steps, then we can manage these people and we can achieve the goal that we want in the end. And then you have a strict manager that keeps track of time and makes sure that everything goes okay and so on and so forth. The underlying assumption in this process was that the worker is by nature lazy. And it wasn't the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, you know, the sort of the later steps of the Industrial Revolution that really started at the end, you know, mid to late 1800s really, but came into the fore in the early 1900s with the development of the Model T Ford, and the rise sort of the American car industry. Wasn't really known for a positive view of mankind in general, because the idea was that everything has to be articulated, everything has to be divided, everything has to be organized, everything has to be structured, controlled, and above all, enforced, right? So these people at the assembly line, they needed to be told exactly what to do, when to do it, and, you know, they weren't supposed to be doing much thinking. They were simply meant to be given very detailed instructions. And this led to, you know, a perspective of organizations as machines, where the worker or the employer, the employee, I should say, not the employer, but or to some extent the employer as well, I suppose, we're all cogs or seen as cogs in a greater machine. So the machine metaphor for thinking about organizations was really prevalent during this time. And it was a lot about sort of specialization and replaceability and standardization and predictability, you know, where you can really predict the outcome of a certain process as much as possible. And the idea of standardization and replaceability and also specialization was to keep things simple, predictable, and keep costs down. Now, Henry Ford famously said that, you know, you can choose to have your Model T Ford in any color you want, as long as you pick black. And that sort of, that joke was really says something about, you know, how did they manage to make things so simple? How can you manage a production line on an assembly line with these unskilled workers? Well, it's because there's only one color. You reduce the amount of errors that can be made, you know. So you make things by standardizing, making the one car with the one color, making it black, not a bunch of other weird colors, not a bunch of other weird models, not a bunch of weird variations with wheels or transmission or engine or anything. You make one car that looks the same everywhere, with a standardized schematic for assembly, standardized schematic for all these various parts that needed to be assembled and in which order, allowed you to build factories with assembly lines that were uniform, you know, across the board, you know. So you could employ these unskilled workers and tell them what to do, and be comfortable in, you don't really have to tell these people what to do. You tell them what to do in that particular small little thing that they're doing, but they don't need to know any more than that. So which means that everyone's replaceable. If one person gets sick, we'll toss that person out and put another one in, or if someone complains too much about not making enough money, or or is injured or something, then we get rid of that person. We can put anyone else. Anyone can replace you at your job. That was the whole point about replaceability, but also about specialization. So there's an element of you get really good at the one thing that you do, right? But it's also a simple enough thing that you're replaceable. It doesn't take very much to get someone else to do it for you, or instead of you, I should say. And that increases also the predictability and workers' mobility. It's not a recipe for happy workers, I should say. This type of perspective on work and perspective on organizing and perspective on humanity, I should say, ran into some problems. It was parodied in the Charlie Chaplin movie Modern Times in 1936, which I'll post a link to that so you can see what that was all about. This is the Model T Ford as it looked. One of the first, at least one of the things that sort of iconically often gets to represent this particular era of modernism or industrialization or the Industrial Revolution. And it was also a time of looking at work and looking at labor and modernization from a very scientific perspective. It was seen as a science, the science of organizing, the science of management. And science, when science gets involved in something that we do, especially around this time, it was all about, we want to understand how we can make this more efficient. And we want to try to optimize the process from a very sort of quantifiable perspective. And around this time, Frederick Winslow Taylor wrote a book called The Principles of Scientific Management. He was, as it says here, past president of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. So he's an engineer. And he really came up with this efficient sort of way of compelling workers to work and to do what you want them to do. How do you get people to do what you want them to do with as little trouble as possible so that you can get the efficiency that you need to manufacture the product that you want manufactured? So that was sort of what Frederick Taylor was interested in. So he did all these studies on, how can we improve efficiency at the assembly line? How can we enforce rules? And, how do we control these workers, these laborers? How do we avoid problems? And, what are the various ways that we can divide the labor and divide the work tasks and, that sort of thing. And usually this had to do with time, measuring how much time does each step in the manufacturing, is each step in the manufacturing process allowed to take, and so on. So a lot of these kinds of optimization studies. Now, as we can see here, and I'm going to mute this hang on, what happened now? Let's see, I think we managed to get lost here a little bit. Here's where we were somewhere. And so Charlie Chaplin in 1936 came out with this famous movie called Modern Times, which was a comment on sort of factory work and what it was like to work at the assembly line. And obviously it's a comedy, so it parodies, the various ways that the assembly line led to sort of slapstick comedy. But at its very bottom, at the bottom of this, or sort of backgrounding this movie, was also a critique, you know, against modernization and against sort of this only thinking about efficiency, you know, only thinking about, you know, what happens if something goes wrong, you know, and how can we, who's blamed when something doesn't go the way it should be going, you know. And, you know, here you can see, you know, the manager is always overseeing the workers and telling workers to work faster. So you have someone here who's a machinist of some sort that cranks up the speed even more to increase efficiency. And then things go really fast, and, you know, get to have short breaks. Let's go in here for a cigarette break. Very briefly, lights up a cigarette, sits down for about, I don't know, 2 seconds maybe. And then immediately the boss shows up on a big screen and tells him to go back to work. So the whole idea of modern times was that it was a comment on this constant sort of fixation on efficiency and what that does, or what it did, I should say, to the workers. In terms of, there was massive discontent, you can say, and you know, led to all sorts of sabotage and discontent and sort of revolts and all this sort of thing. But it was sort of it was also a sign of the times a little bit. You had all these different schools of thought that sort of emerged around the same time. You had classical management, founded by Henry Fayol, had to do with planning and organizing and command and coordination and control. And the whole idea was that planning should be accomplished by, you know, enforcing hierarchy and stovepiping. In other words, you know, orders trickle from the very top of an organization and down. You know, communication flows from the top down. You take orders from one person. One person is your manager. If you are a group of people that are organized according to the same goal, then you take orders from the same supervisor, a clear division of labor. You have a designated place in the factory for your particular task. And each manager has control over a limited number of employees so that you can, you know, keep these people in check. Power in Fayol's philosophy should be centralized to one person. It should be authoritative and it should be disciplined. And people that aren't producing or that are complaining or that are showing dissent should be punished. That's what disciplined means, you know. Max Weber formed a similar school of thought, you know, the bureaucratic school, which emphasized this idea of the organization as a closed system with a strict hierarchy. You know, there shouldn't be any emotion in the workplace. There's nothing is relevant. There's nothing emotional that is relevant in the workplace, because the workplace is a functional place where you do functional tasks. Neither you do them or you don't do them. There's no room for emotion, you know. Also, centralized power and control. One manager that controls a group of employees, and driven by this, you know, like I said, this rational and legal authority that if you don't do what you signed on to do, then you're in breach of contract, and then you'll be fired or you'll be disciplined. And then we have scientific management, which we've sort of mentioned a little bit before. Frederick Taylor, and you know, who advocated decision-making separated from production. So you don't ask the people in the production line, you know, about how something should be designed or how a particular task should be organized. Managers make the decisions. Laborers labor, two separate things. He was all for the standardizing of tasks because it required minimum training. You know, you can employ these unskilled laborers, as I said before. And he would employ time studies to describe tasks in minute detail, and also as a basis for salary. So the faster you could work, the more you'd get paid. The slower you work, the less you'd be paid. He was also all for a clear division of labor where each person only does a few simple tasks, to keep things as standardized and simple and predictable as possible. But this, as I said before, led to massive dissatisfaction. And at the time, they didn't really make the connection between dissatisfaction and efficiency, because there was such a functionalist approach to work, where the work was all the focus was on work, on how to design work that would so that it would be as efficient as possible. But this led to a lot of unhappy workers, obviously, because working conditions were atrocious, hours were atrocious, salaries were atrocious, and the fact that you were replaceable by more or less anyone that would line up outside the factory looking for a job made the job situation very unstable. And often these were poor people that worked in the factories, and it was dirty and dangerous and horrible, and it was just a bad situation all over. And this is what we call today then Fordism. This is part of the Fordist type of management, or the Fordist way of approaching production, where very much focus on the work and designing the work tasks and efficiency and that sort of thing. Now, all this discontent then, what did that lead to? What happened? Well, eventually, as the decades went on, there started to be a bit of a shift where the perspective shifted from work to the worker. So instead of focusing so much on how the work should be designed and how we can make the work more efficient, there started to be sort of a dawning of a new perspective where you would instead ask, how can we make the worker more efficient? How can we compel the worker to do his or her best? Is there any way that we can make something more efficient by working on the worker, rather than working on the work that needs to be done? So maybe we should not make the workers so replaceable. Maybe we should focus on finding the right person for the right job, and then using the worker to improve the situation and improve efficiency. And so this is part of what's called the human relations movement, where there was much more focus on people, not machines. There was an increased emphasis on social interaction. There was a realization sort of gradually that the workplace is a social place, and people are social beings, that maybe this would impact efficiency in a way that we haven't really exploited before. So the perspective also shifted from, it wasn't all about manual labor, discussing the manual labor. It was more discussion about, discussing like, how can we harvest ideas from the workers? How can we use non-monetary rewards and penalties to compel these people to do their best? Maybe we, instead of docking pay for each time there's a mistake, maybe we can use sort of, instead of docking pay when there's a mistake, why don't we say that you'll get paid more if we'll keep the incentive that you get paid more if you do more work, but why don't we also say that, well, you can get a couple of days off if you do extra good work, or you can have we'll improve your workstation. Like the more you work, the more efficient you are, the more we'll try to improve your working situation. So there was this, this realization that there are lots of non-monetary rewards and penalties that could be used, instead of, it's not all about money and looking at the work as sort of a process. Now, there was also the realization that we can employ both formal and informal leadership to compel workers to do their best. That there are ways to communicate that doesn't always have to come from, you know, top down. You know, communication can flow upward from down. There's, you know, workers that have a particular task that they do over and over, might have ideas on how can we make this better, how can we optimize this process. And I could ask the person that is standing at a particular part of the assembly line and ask this person, so when you assemble these two pieces, exactly how are you doing that? Is there anything in your workspace here in the factory that we could change to make this step easier for you? Well, maybe if I had a chair I could sit on here when I do this thing, I could assemble these two pieces faster. So, okay, well, we'll put a chair there. And suddenly, when this person has a chair to sit on, efficiency increases, right? It's still about efficiency, but there are different ways, you know, emergent different ways to go about making sure that we have optimum efficiency. So human relations was an organizational theoretical school that emerged in the 1940s and 50s. So we're about 20, 30 years onward. Roots in the Hawthorne studies. In the human relations school, Taylorism and traditional organizational theories were criticized for placing too much emphasis on the formal organization rather than on the informal organization. Social relations and informal rules in the workplace. Group processes and leadership were two key issues in this movement. So there's much more focus on groupthink, discussion, democracy, ideas, harvesting ideas from the employees, and making sure that and also realizing that an organization is not simply a matter of putting machines in the hands of people and telling them what to do. There's a whole other social aspect to a workplace. Machines and minds have to kind of meld together and live in a kind of symbiotic relationship. So like I said before, human relations focused on people, not machines, emphasized social interaction, not monetary rewards and penalties, not merely manual labor. There was discussion, there were ideas, there were formal and informal leadership styles, and communication was allowed to travel upward and laterally. So this led to what we then called the human resource management and the Hawthorne studies and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we'll take it one step at a time here. So Elton Mayo was one of the key sort of scientists responsible for the Hawthorne experiments. And these were a series of experiments that studied studied how an increase in work productivity caused by the psychological stimulus that is a result of feeling important and singled out has affected sort of, you know, how we plan and employ and use workers in factories. Now, these Hawthorne experiments, they were supposed to study efficiency and how environmental factors and technological factors affect efficiency. But instead, the Hawthorne experiments are these kind of famously failed experiments that they didn't at all study what they were supposed to study, but we still learned something from these experiments. Basically, they were three sort of famous experiments designed by and led by Vannevar Bush, this famous MIT scientist who was in other contexts kind of responsible for the early version of the internet, which was a completely sort of mechanical machine that with these sort of Rolodex cards that, you know, you push a button and it finds a Rolodex card and there are arms that were moving and stuff. And he did all this in the 40s. So he was quite the pioneer when it came to automation and engineering. So he was a big name at MIT at the time. And he designed these experiments together with the ideas of Elton Mayo. And I'll go through one of these experiments. They all more or less had the same problem, and they all resulted in the same effect, I should say. And I'll go through the first one, the illumination study. The illumination study, the purpose of the illumination study was to verify an idea that these scientists had. And that was that level of illumination has a direct impact on workers' efficiency. But they didn't know how quite. So what they did was they took an MIT scientist, an engineer, with a, with the white lab coat and the clipboard and everything, put him in a factory, measured the level of luminance or the light level in the factory, also on the factory floor. I think it was in a one of these textile factories, and where all these women were working. And the scientist came and measured the level of illumination and made a note of how much these workers were producing per day or per hour or whatever it was. And then they increased the level of light slightly, and then measured again to see, does an increase in light level have any sort of effects on efficiency? And they measured, and they came up with a result that pointed towards that there was an increase in efficiency. So they sewed even more and even faster. They were, more productive. The more the light was turned up. And then they started to dim the lights. They turned the lights down and they turned off lights, thinking that is going to reduce efficiency. But it turns out that efficiency went up even more when they turned down the lights. So they kept going up and down with the lights, and the more they changed the lights up or down, efficiency increased. And they didn't really know how can that be? How can they work more even though we turn down the lights? And it turns out that these women in the factory, they were so flattered and excited to have someone from MIT come and do any sort of studies or take any sort of interest in their working environment, that they felt that, oh, we better work even more now. For each thing that they do, we're going to work even more. And this excitement, or this sort of awareness of the scientist in the room basically ruined the study, because they were so affected by this person with the clipboard that they felt compelled to work even more to show that they were excited to have someone do a study on them. And a bit more or less the same result with the switchboard assembly, where you were supposed to assemble a switchboard and perform certain tasks with a switchboard, and also performance-based wages. All these three experiments didn't go the way that they thought that they would be going, because of how the scientist or the person in charge of the experiment had designed the experiments. And so the scientific aspect of this kind of wrecked the result. So just what it says here, the problem was that awareness that you're being monitored affects the result, and that's called the Hawthorne effect. Another theory that was prominent during this time of human resources and human relations was theory X and theory Y. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that in the early not early industrial revolution, but in the 20s, in the 10s and 20s, with the scientific management, the worker was assumed to be lazy and stupid, and you have to plant this person, in the factory, give him specific things to do, and be as unskilled as possible to cause as little problems as possible. Here it was quite different. Well, you had two types of perspectives then. Not only that mankind is fundamentally lazy, well, that's one perspective, but then theory Y also emerged here, where that held that people are able to self-motivate. There are ways that we can compel people to work more. And how do we combine these two? Can we combine the idea that, people are lazy, fundamentally lazy, but we also know that everyone has the ability to self-motivate. And combining these two perspectives gives us leadership, meaning that put the right person as manager, and you can compel people to self-motivate and to be responsible people. Now, we're going to take a short break here. We have emerged. Let's see, where are we? There we go. We're now sort of here. We have the last section left, but in the interest of not keeping these movie clips too long, we're going to stop right there and continue in the next clip. Thanks for listening.